Good morning to all those joining us in the United States, and a very good evening to friends and colleagues in South Asia. My name is Akriti Vasudeva, and I'm a research analyst at the Stimson Center and managing editor of South Asian Voices, an online policy platform that features analysis on the security, politics, and economics of the subcontinent. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the second South Asian Voices webinar, a series in which we examine significant developments in the region. Our topic for discussion today will be the future of India-China relations in light of the ongoing border crisis between the two countries. Even as India and China celebrate the 70th anniversary of the establishment of their diplomatic ties this year, the relationship has been under tremendous strain due to tensions erupting on their border, particularly in the Ladakh sector. On June 15th, a brutal clash between Indian and Chinese troops in the Galwan Valley led to the first casualties on the border in several decades. And though both sides have since agreed to disengage and de-escalate, with that process being implemented currently and that's underway, what is increasingly clear is that the crisis is likely to have a serious impact on the India-China relationship, as has already been acknowledged by Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. Indeed, we're already seeing this play out in some recent Indian actions and statements, such as the Indian Ministry of Information Technology banning 59 mobile apps from China, citing data security and privacy concerns, or Indian Ministry of Transport saying that India will not allow Chinese companies to invest in highway construction in India. So today we will examine how India-China's strategic, military, diplomatic, and economic relations are likely to evolve in light of the border crisis, and how the tensions may impact the regional balance of power in South Asia. And to discuss all of these aspects and more, I'm joined by a stellar panel of young India, China, and Pakistan watchers, most of whom are regular contributors to South Asian Voices. So we have with us today Kushan Das, who is head of forums at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, and he tracks Indian military modernization very closely. Antara Ghoshal Singh is a research associate at the Delhi Policy Group. She's proficient in Mandarin, and her research focuses on Chinese discourse analysis. We have Tunir Mukherjee, who is an independent researcher and who examines naval modernization in South Asia and India-China maritime competition. Riaz Khokar is a researcher at the Center for International Strategic Studies in Islamabad, and he focuses on Pakistan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. And finally, my colleague Zoe Jordan, who is a research assistant at Stimson South Asia program and was previously a Yenching scholar at Peking University. So I'll start by asking each of our panelists a few questions of my own, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you, to the audience. And we are collecting questions throughout the discussion. So if you'd like to ask our panelists something, please type your query into the Q&A box and direct it to me, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. So let me begin with you, Antara. Your expertise, as I said, is in Chinese discourse analysis, and you track Mandarin language media and commentary in China very closely. Based on your reading of Chinese sources, is the Chinese assertiveness and poking on the border that we're seeing in Ladakh, is it driven by bilateral factors, such as Indian infrastructure development, or is it part of a broader pattern of Chinese adventurism that we've seen in its neighborhood, whether it's towards Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, now Bhutan, or is it a bit of both? And how much was the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir a motivator or not for Beijing's actions, based on your analysis?
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Akriti. And before I answer your question, I will take this opportunity to thank South Asian Voices for inviting us, for bringing us all together today and giving us this wonderful platform to put forward our views. So a big thank you to all of you for this. So back to your question. I would like to answer this in the light of the recent research that I did on China-India ties in the backdrop of the Galwan incident. And I will just quickly run you through some of my research findings to give you a perspective of the background of my answer. So, I've been following this incident very closely since day one, and in both Chinese and Indian media. And what I found during the process is that in India, there was some sort of a clear, overwhelming consensus that this is an inflection point, and this is probably the watershed moment in India-China relations where we need to relook at our ties, and it cannot be business as usual. But when I looked into the Chinese debates and discussion, I could not see this kind of conviction or this kind of consensus within the Chinese strategic community. And what I saw was like two strong but mutually contradictory line of thinking over there. So on one hand, a section of strategic community in China were discussing that the incident is nothing of a surprise because it was just about to happen. India was, it was getting too adventurous in its policies, and therefore it had to be taught a lesson. It was taking advantage of various predicaments that China was facing both internally and externally, and it was. India was misinterpreting China's restraint as weakness, and therefore China had to relook at its policy, and it had to relook at the prevalent strategic thinking in China that India is not the primary strategic direction, and therefore peace should be maintained in that direction. So, China, they are arguing that they should adopt a new policy where there is no room for concession, weakness, or defensive defense. So, China needs to kind of crack down on India, attack India wherever possible. And this attacking posture is, it is understood that this will dampen India's speculative or adventurous spirit, its problematic diplomacy towards China. And this problematic diplomacy actually involves both its policy in Jammu and Kashmir, in Doklam, and also the infrastructure development at the border areas. The Chinese understanding is that this will dampen India's spirit somehow and buy it peace for a long time in the Western frontier. On the other hand, this could also be shown in the world as as China's success, or as the fact that China is not a paper tiger, and and it therefore needs to be handled carefully by its other opponents in the eastern sector. So that is, of course, one line of thinking. And another thing that I would like to bring to your notice is these scholars, they do not have a very positive outlook towards the future course of China-India relations. And they believe that, US-India rapprochement is the strategic trend. And there is little that China can do to reverse this process. So what China, as a bigger and better power than India, what China needs to do is not to strive to win over India, but to probably maintain a very basic, a very minimalistic kind of relationship with India, where there is much room for, say, discords and disagreements, and even say smaller or medium-scale conflicts. So this is one line of thinking that I told you. Another line is, of course, that India as a rising power is important to China, and the relationship is going to be the most important relationship after China and the United States relations. And this policy of teaching India a lesson might not be a good strategy. It might be counterproductive. It might be short-sighted because it only takes into account the negativities between the two countries and not the positive developments that have happened in the last couple of years. And they take the example of Indo-Pacific in this case, and they say that India is the only country which puts a lot of value to this concept of strategic autonomy, and under normal circumstances would like to balance its relation between United States and China. But and that was probably one of the key to China to release the pressure that has been created by the concept of Indo-Pacific. But I can see a lot of concern in China over losing this bridge that they had over the Indo-Pacific concept. So on the other hand, they warn that a hostile India could create more trouble for China in terms of its access to the Indian Ocean, in terms of the anti-China sentiment that is currently prevailing all over the world, and in terms of reorganization of international organizations, global supply chains, and so on and so forth. And militarily also, they believe that it is not a good idea to get into a direct conflict with India because A, for the cost factor, and B, for because it can lead to chain reaction in the international situation, which might or might not be in China's capacity to control. So they are of the opinion that China should carry on with this policy of, with its existing policy of maintaining peace and order towards India, while encouraging other countries like Pakistan or Nepal to check and balance India in South Asia. So from these two separate trend of thinking that I found in the Chinese strategic circles, I came to two inferences. One is that this overwhelming or this overpowering image that China has in India or maybe in other parts of the world, that it is a very decisive power. It is a very, very resolute force, which is like a nation on a mission, with little dilemmas and contradictions. That hypothesis is not really true. It has plenty of contradictions and dilemmas and perceived vulnerabilities, which needs to be probably studied in a more detailed format. And the second inference that I draw is that China's India dilemma should not be seen in isolation. It should be put into the context of China's greater dilemmas. The deeper and darker dilemmas that China has about itself, about its identity, about its interests in the present international situation. I often see Chinese strategists arguing about some of the key questions, like, is China an ordinary country or a superpower? Is China a developing country or a developed country? Is it a strong country or a weak country, a poor country or a rich country? Should it continue with its policy of hiding strength and biding time, or should it come out in the open as the wolf warriors? So, and these questions really do not have a clear-cut answer within the Chinese strategic community. I think that, to my understanding, and the ongoing pandemic and the uncertainty that has been introduced by the pandemic has somehow intensified these contradictions, internal contradictions within Chinese strategic community. And to my understanding, these contradictions and these confusions that China has about itself, about its identity, and about its interest is what is making China's foreign policy rather erratic and unpredictable. So I think that would explain to some extent about your question about why China is doing what China is doing in today's time. So yeah, that is what I would like to contribute over here.
Thank you, Antra. And I'd like to come back to you later in the session about sort of these two opposing viewpoints in China about India and how they might be reconciled. But I'll come back to you later on that. Let me turn to you, Pushan, and wanted to sort of ask from India's point of view. In the aftermath of the Galwan incident, there's been a lot of debate. There's been a lot of calls from former diplomats and China hands in India who've called for a hard-nosed reassessment of India's China policy. Many have suggested that India should undertake internal balancing. It should build its military capabilities to deter future Chinese aggression. But these calls are not new, right? We've seen these calls before, particularly after the Doklam conflict between India and China in 2017. There was a view that India needs to take the China threat more seriously and pursue military modernization with more rigor. So in your assessment, will this crisis lead to a more broad-based and sustained Indian effort to plug its capability gap with China? And you've pointed to some of these in your SAV piece, particularly between the PLA Air Force and the Indian Air Force. And how will this plugging of the gap with China be achieved? Because we are seeing India's economy was slowing down even before coronavirus, and now there are increasing pressures on the defense budgets because of COVID, and that's been a concern as well.
Thanks, Akriti. And I know you've asked me a question, but I'm going to start off by countering something that Antara said and then get to your question. Two words really stood out to me towards the end of Antara's presentation. Chinese foreign policy, erratic, and maybe there's a bit of unpredictability in terms of its foreign policy pushes, how it's deploying coercive tactics. But this is not something new. Over the past decade, China has been deploying coercive tactics on multiple territorial fronts. So there is no unpredictability around this. You look at the East China Sea, you look at the South China Sea, you look at the India-China border, you look at the US, and with questions of freedom of navigation. So I think there's a clear trend in Chinese foreign policy when it comes to how it wants to exercise its coercive power and lay claims to what it considers to be future territories. And China's military modernization and reforms over the last 10 odd years, especially in the Xi years, are in line to expand its political and economic footprint around the globe. And all of these do pose a strategic challenge to India. And now getting to your question, there has been a call to reassess this. Again, coming back to what I've just been talking about, if this has been a Chinese trend for the last 10, 15 years, then why is that we need to reassess this? Over the last decade, we have had a number of, you look at Depsang in 2013, you look at Chumar in 2014, we were involved in a 73-day standoff in Doklam, like you said, in 2017. So, none of this is new. I think the only thing that is new in this skirmish is that, instead of having these skirmishes or standoffs in single locations along the line of actual control, this time they've happened in multiple points at the same time. And obviously, no one could predict the violent nature the violent turn of events that would take place. So, none of this is new. So, if you talk to people in the Indian Army or the Indian strategic circles, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they would tell you that, well, Pakistan is a military threat, but, the bigger strategic threat is China. So, what have you been doing? Have you been twiddling thumbs for all these years? These are questions to be asked. The same strategic thinkers who call about reassessing our India's policy towards China are the same ones who were talking about China being a big threat 10 years ago. So, I take that bit of salt, but from defense modernization perspective, I mean, we have always been behind the curve. I think it's not something that you can lay blame to the NDA government or the previous Congress government. I think India has chronically underspent on defense, especially in terms of keeping up with the strategic challenges and military challenges that it faces in the neighborhood, Pakistan and China, both. So I think there's a realization, like it happens after every single conflict that we've been in. You look at Kargil, you look at 26/11, the terror strikes in Bombay, you look at, let's say, Doklam. After every single conflict, the Ministry of Defense goes into overtime and, green light emergency purchases of weapons. And this time, I think they've green lighted emergency purchases of weapons up to 9,000 crores Indian rupees, which includes MiG-29s, Sukhoi 30s, S-400, surface-to-air missiles, etc., etc. But all of this is quite ad hoc. At the end of the day, if you're not going to have a national security document saying that laying out these are the 2-3 threats that you have, and you need the military to build on to build to counter those threats, it becomes difficult. At the end of the day, you can't make fast track purchases and hope to pose a long-term strategic challenge to China. Even these defense deals which have been approved recently, while they are fast-track purchases, they'll take 3 years to at least for them to start coming into Indian service. So what does India do in the interim? I mean, if you compare it to China, the military reforms that have been carried out, India's scorecard is incremental at best. Xi Jinping, since coming to power in 2012, he's ushered in large-scale military reforms, which has fundamentally transformed the way the PLA fights, the way it is structured, the kind of technologies that they're coming online in. But it also helps the fact that their primary threat focus is the US, and they're in a near peer competition with the US and not necessarily with India. So the sort of technologies that they aspire to are very different from what India can afford. But if you look at the last 6 years of the Modi government, India's GDP in terms of defense spending in terms of GDP has fallen to a 20-year low. I think it's even lower than 1962 at the moment. It has implemented a politically rewarding one rank, one pension scheme for all its veterans, which has proved to be expensive and now can't invest enough money in defense modernization. In contrast to this, you have China cutting down the number of troops that it has, but investing in hard military technology, so to speak. We have also been late to jump on the boat in creating a combined defense services chief, who over the next few, whose role we still don't know much about, but in the next few years, you'll see how he restructures India's military commands and places them better to see the strategic places them better vis-a-vis the strategic threats that India faces. But at the end of the day, I think personally, I don't think India's options are necessarily lie in modernizing its military more. While it's an important facet to have to create that conventional deterrence value, I think in the short term, India will have to deepen its engagement with the Quad. It will have to invite Australia to Malabar, which I've read some reports they will do in the coming months. Hold China accountable for the COVID-19 pandemic, elevate its engagement with Taiwan, etc., etc. So there are a number of issues, and lastly, India's military challenge to China is also complicated by the presence of Pakistan on its western border, which poses its own military threat. So Pakistan's relationship with China today is much more extensive than it was in 1962. The two have exchanged nuclear secrets. China has invested billions and billions of dollars into building infrastructure from Western China towards the Arabian Sea through Pakistan. The port of Badr. In fact, if you look at reports recently after the Galwan clash happened, the Pakistani intelligence agencies had a very unusual meeting with the Pakistani High Command met at Rawalpindi. So, these sort of things don't assuage India's threat perception of a 2.5 front war, so to speak. So, I think India's military challenges are far more. It can't be seen so simplistically as to countering China in the northern border adequately without being able to take into account Pakistan's military threat on its west. And I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A. I just thought I'd start off on these few notes.
Thanks, Bhushan. And we'll talk a little bit more about, China, India, Pakistan triangular dynamics, but just a two-finger on what you said. So the national security strategy, there was, some conversation about that document being sort of prepared by the new chief of defense staff. What's the latest you've heard on that?
The national security document was actually not being prepared by the new chief of defense staff. It was being prepared by the NSA. And the national, the CDS's office would play a role in formulating the national security document. But again, it's a chicken and egg situation. If you don't have an articulated foreign policy, it's difficult to formulate a national security document per se. So, in the absence of that, you have each service creating their own doctrines. The Navy came out with a doctrine a couple of years back where they pretty much covered everything that a Navy is supposed to do, without any particular direction. The Air Force came out with the doctrine in 2012 where they wanted to play a large strategic role. But, a strategic role to what end? What are India's strategic goals? If you can't articulate that, it's very difficult to build and modernize a military to meet those.
Thanks, Bhushan. Tanir, I'll come to you next and sort of taking off from what I was, talking to Bhushan with about sort of the question of balancing and, the role of the Quad or sort of the maritime element of India-China relations. And, most scholars agree that the maritime domain will be sort of the main domain of competition between India and China in the future. And as you've written for South Asian Voices, the Indian Navy has already taken some, concrete measures to try to account for increased Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, whether that's by improving its maritime domain awareness with partners in the region, or starting the mission-based employments. And it's also developed robust maritime partnerships with the US and other countries in the Quad and France. But there's also been some hesitation in sort of doing more things outside of the primary area of responsibility of the Indian Navy, which is the Indian Ocean region, such as doing more in the South China Sea, or undertaking certain kinds of actions. So in light of this crisis, what impact basically is this crisis going to have on India-China maritime competition? And are we going to see, a change in the way that India operates on the maritime domain as it considers sort of ways of pushing back against China? And is that possible, because again, like Bhushan was saying, the defense cuts, but particularly the Navy is the least funded of the three services.
For having me here, and to the rest of the panelists for sharing their commentaries on South Asia Voices regarding the different aspects of India-China relations. I remember, this year was supposed to be the 70th anniversary of India-China relations, and I look at how China is sort of celebrating it. An open conflict is there, not just in Ladakh sector, but there have been reports of skirmishes happening all across the line of actual control. In retrospect, when you look at how China has developed its naval power over the last few years, there's a clear trend visible. It has modernized its navy, its military, and most importantly, the strategic doctrine with which it functions all across the board. In comparison, in India, there has been a reluctant sort of government that has not been able to completely exercise all the options that it has to its disposal. Most importantly, when it comes to the naval domain, the defense budget allocates the least amount of funding to the naval forces. And even inside that, the capital expenditure budget that is given to the Navy to acquire new vessels or new technology is, not even 1/10 of what the Chinese are investing in right now, especially in emerging technologies in the maritime domain. That being said, given the limited choices India has in internal balancing and improving its naval power or increasing its naval capacity, there's a lot of choices for India when it comes to external balancing options. And some of that has already been discussed widely in analysis for the last few years. The most important being the quadrilateral security initiative between India, the United States, Australia, and Japan. At this point in time, India's primary focus of operation remains to be the Indian Ocean, between the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca, which itself is a very big maritime domain and needs a lot of resources to be invested in maintaining maritime domain awareness, in ensuring security of the sea lanes of communication, and most importantly, protecting the Indian homeland against external threats. So while Chinese naval assets have become increasingly present in the Indian Ocean, they still haven't done anything to the extent of directly challenging India's interests in the region. And until that point really comes across, India has very few options at its disposal to sort of push back against China in the maritime domain, just to sort of balance its strategic options in the continental domain. I don't see India attacking Chinese naval assets or even Chinese civilian ships in the Indian Ocean region as a sort of a response to incursions in a mountainous territory in Ladakh or even in the eastern part of in Arunachal. So in that sense, given India's limited options in the maritime domain at this point in time, unless China really escalates the war to a position where India needs to sort of force its hand, I don't foresee India taking any direct kinetic action against Chinese assets in the maritime sphere. What India can do, though, is by means of strategic messaging, cooperate with countries like France, the United States, Australia, Japan, in information sharing, in logistical exchange agreements, conducting frequent naval exercises in the Indian Ocean and outside the Indian Ocean. Most importantly, also bring in a lot of partners from the Southeast Asian regions, so not to make it look like a sort of a club of bigger middle powers with military might coming together to sort of bully China or contain China. There needs to be a line of thinking, and I think that has been already expressed by Prime Minister Modi in the Shangri-La dialogue in 2017, and pardon me, 2018, about how there needs to be an inclusive security architecture inside the Indian Ocean and broadly the Indo-Pacific. So capacity building needs to be done, exchanges need to be done with countries like such as Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, to sort of keep both options open and not make it seem like a exclusive club of, somebody called it the Asian NATO. When it comes to the South China Sea, China has very clearly built up its infrastructure, both civilian and military, over the last few years. And it's clearly visible from the satellite imagery that is available to us. Over the last 10 years, China has clearly shown its willingness to completely occupy all the territories that it marks as its own in inside the 9-dash line. So for India to be operating inside the 9-dash line is very different than India operating somewhere in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. I do not see India doing any counter theater presence at this point. Clearly, its priorities are in the Indian Ocean. What India can do, and what importantly India should do, is do frequent naval exercises in places like the Sea of Japan, in the Philippine Sea, near Guam, with Australia, in the southeastern Indian Ocean region, to push the message to China that we are on the periphery of your, maritime backyard, ready. The force deployments are ready. Operationally, we are ready. So at this point, it seems, limited options, but a lot of strategic messaging could be done. Just to touch upon other logistical aspects at the same time, for India to operate outside the Indian Ocean in the South China Sea without any coalition partners as such is a very, very big ask from the Indian. I do not think it is possible the way the United States Navy functions with aircraft carriers, all across the Western Pacific. It has bases in Japan. It has support from countries like South Korea and Australia and Philippines. For India to be replicating that is a very tall ask. Just to finally, come across the point that when it comes to India, there is again a very big reluctance to directly engage China in its own backyard. And if we are to shed that, there needs to be a very clear escalation in conflict dynamics between the two countries. I don't see India having any naval sort of strategy at its disposal other than that.
Thanks, Sunir. And I just thought I'll mention that, India did join US, Japan, and Philippines for a group sail in the South China Sea last year. And a partner that I don't think you mentioned, Russia, there was some media reports today that India and Russia are looking to conclude a mutual logistics agreement themselves, which is very interesting and fitting into what you were saying. So we'll come back to some of that. And Riaz, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about how Pakistan is seeing this crisis, and sort of let's talk about the region a little bit more. So how are Delhi-Beijing tensions likely to impact the China-India-Pakistan triangular dynamics? So scholars like Stimson's Yoon Soon have argued that Beijing has sought to bolster Pakistan to balance India in the region by strengthening Islamabad's military capabilities and investing in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So with the India-China relationship sort of heating up and becoming increasingly more competitive, what does Pakistan see as its equities in the region?
Right. First of all, thank you, Akriti and the Stimson Center for providing me with this great opportunity to speak on the China-India-Pakistan triangular dynamics. China-Pakistan strategic partnership started with the breakup in the Sino-Indian ties in 1962, as they shared the mutual hostility toward India. But the relationship hasn't just confined to the India factor, although it is the predominant one. Let me start with the Sino-Indian tension part of the question. The fact that India and China have a comical contention of fighting with punches in clubs, Pakistanis are worried that India's arms and technology will be used extensively in its military confrontation with Pakistan. India will definitely acquire, through its top arms supplier, the latest military and technological capabilities in both land and maritime domains as a means to counter China's continental and maritime assertiveness, but it will only place Pakistan in a tight spot. I doubt that Sino-Indian conflict will suit Pakistani interests. Instead, it would exacerbate its worries with respect to India's growing military power and the associated risk-taking tendencies of the country. Narendra Modi has kind of set the bar for responding to a terrorist attack inside the country by conducting aerial strikes on Pakistani territory. I'm skeptical that it would change under a different kind of government, say that of Indian National Congresses. The mass nationalist wave and the media activism in India have only amplified the voices for offensive military posture. Pakistan has yet to remain on guard 24/7. The more India's arms suppliers equip India with the latest military technology, the more India will feel powerful enough to take risk, and the narrower the nuclear threshold will become for Pakistan. India's counterforce temptations have actually shrunk the bandwidth for pushing the end button. The next hit-and-run airstrikes by India will be followed by Pakistan's quid pro quo strikes, and no one knows where this will lead. Well, these hit-and-run strikes will not enter the end zone, but the uncertain and unpredictable nature of the escalation of conflict will definitely lead to that eventuality. On the argument that Beijing strengthens Pakistan's military capabilities and economic capacity to balance India, well, Unison is not alone in making that argument. South Asian observers across the board are suggesting that. But Unison makes a another fascinating argument. China has largely two leverages with respect to India: the border demarcation and its investments in Pakistan's military capabilities, or the economic strength. India's got one: its alignment with the US bloc to contain or confront China. Now, while China's leverages are irreversible, India's leverage is reversible. This is the argument of Unison. If China stops supporting Pakistan or resolves its territorial dispute with India, either of these steps does not guarantee that India will stop contending or confronting China. So the fact of the matter is that China and India are geopolitical rivals in South Asia, although they have had a strong bilateral trade relationship of around $110 billion, and they cooperate on the global commons like climate change, anti-terrorism efforts, and maritime security, and are part of regional economic and counterterrorism groupings like BRICS, SCO, AIIB, but they are nonetheless geopolitical and geoeconomic competitors. And to quote a paragraph from Daniel Marquis' recent book, China's Western Horizon, their geopolitical competition is rooted in the nationalist narratives and the classical security dilemma, in which each tends to see the other's strength as a potential threat. Both the countries are thousands of years old civilizations and consider South, Central, and East Asia as their natural sphere of influence through linguistic and cultural linkages, and try to assert their regional hegemony. China offered to India, I think this to change the name of the CPEC corridor by replacing Pakistan in it with something else, but India refused due in part to its overall concerns with respect to the concept of the BRI and the fact that China is competing with India in its backyard and has political and economic influence in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and elsewhere. India finds China's backing behind its neighboring states confronting voices or resistance to India's regional goals. Beijing's 25-year-long or $400 billion this investment package for Iran, including in the Iranian seaport of this Chabahar and the railway track that India had been trying to invest in for about I think 20 years, will only 17 years, I think, will only make the matters worse for New Delhi. Now, here is how China factors into the India-Pakistan relations. China invests in Pakistan's military and nuclear capabilities, offers diplomatic support in favor of the resolution of the Kashmir dispute and against India's membership in the NSG. Now, this infuriates definitely India. China has also sought to stabilize Pakistan's internal security and plays the role of a balancer of India's growing military strength. Yet it offers India some concessions on the terrorism issue. And China-India strong economic ties. This is also play a role of a moderator, like Pakistan assumes this, on India's hostility towards Pakistan. China is India's largest trading partner with $110 billion trade through investments in Indian industries of electronics, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and startups, among others. According to a report, I think India will be the greatest beneficiary of Chinese investments of between $80 billion to and something like $110 billion in the next couple of years. Pakistan expects that Beijing's strong economic ties and robust diplomatic cooperation on global challenges of terrorism, climate change, and international organizations will act as a moderator on India's hostile behavior towards Pakistan. And China's unrelenting commitment to CPEC investments has made Pakistan optimistic about its economic future in ways that the country appears to prefer economic development and security inside the country and the borders. However, India doesn't see Chinese investments in its backyard as playing the role of a stabilizer. These are, of course, threatening for India. Now, this leads to me this last part of the question that about what Pakistan sees the equities, for example, in the India-China competition. Well, or competition. I think the relationship between India and China has always been competitive. Like Sean, I think mentioned this. The question is whether the relationship will become a confrontational one and how it augurs for Pakistan. I think there is a gap between academic discourse and India's policy perspective. I think India and China seek de-escalation officially and peace on the borders. Whether the relationship will become confrontational is yet to be seen. I wrote this in my essay article, and there's I think a couple of questions on this that I re-emphasize here again. That India will not want to antagonize China. India will continue what it's been doing for many years. It will not fight against China. It will manage the China challenge by partnering primarily with Russia, but also with France, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and of course the US. But India will not follow the confrontation part of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, only the balancing part. About the Pakistan securities, like I said, Pakistan feels threatened. I mean, Pakistan thinks that what India is going to do after this conflict with China. Of course, Pakistan will feel threatened if India adopts a confrontational military strategy, threatens CPEC through military strikes, or conducts any covert operation inside the country. So Pakistan will likely remain on alert and speak against India's threats. In the near future, security may remain as fragile as it is now on India-Pakistan border unless there is a U-turn on India's side. Like US would like to see India stabilizes the crisis with Pakistan and addresses the human rights issue in Kashmir and the post-citizenship amendment demonstrations across the country. Unless India does that, I doubt that things will improve in Pakistan-India equation. I stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Riaz. And in the spirit of dialogue, Bhushan, you wanted to sort of make a few points in response? Just 2 minutes, Bhushan.
I'll make a couple of quick points and I'll just respond to some of the Riaz's assertions. I mean, I think it's well known academically and internationally, if any country has lowered the threshold of nuclear weapons used in the India-Pakistan dynamic, it is Pakistan. So, to assert otherwise, I think is counterproductive. You talk about BRI, India rejecting BRI, but I mean, we do have concerns. The BRI goes through what we consider to be Indian territory held by Pakistan. So those concerns have been amply made, and China needs to respect India's sovereignty issues for it to be able to move forward. And I also wanted to counter you on that. The assumption that you think that India-China the deep economic ties between India and China are going to be can be somehow leveraged by Pakistan in its let's say in any conflict with India, because China will play sort of a moderating. I mean, India is making concerted efforts, especially post Galwan, to reduce its dependence on the Chinese economy, to reduce its trade ties. So I'm not quite sure how that is going to pan out. But the ball is also in Pakistan's court, so to speak. I don't think China has given India a pass on the issues of terrorism emanating from Pakistan, which are clearly issues. If nothing else, I mean, we have seen in the news cycle, while China, the clash along the border has taken all the headlines, but there has been a spike in terms of the number of terrorist infiltrations that have happened in Kashmir, the number of terrorist strikes that have happened in Kashmir. And it has led a lot of Indian strategists to believe that, when there's something hot along the India-China border, Pakistan plays second fiddle to tie down India's armed forces along the Western Front, so India can't deploy along its northern borders with China to meet that Chinese strategic threat. So, I think these are questions that one also needs to consider. And I think if you leave the issues of terrorism, BRI, etc., out, I don't think that's representing a full picture of what the role Pakistan plays in this triad.
Thanks, Bhushan. And I'll leave some time at the end for anyone who wants to respond to those comments as well. But I wanted to move on a little bit to talk about China's worldview and goals and how India fits into that. And Zoe, you've spent the last 6 years studying and doing research in China. And roughly around this time, we've seen the assertive turn in Chinese foreign policy under President Xi Jinping. We've also seen the adoption of the 2 centennial goals, one of which is that China wants to be a fully developed, rich, and powerful nation by 2049, which analysts have essentially linked to China striving to be the world's superpower. So how does India fit into this narrative? How does India fit into China's worldview?
thank you, Akriti, and thank you to the other panelists. I can try to summarize some of what we said from Beijing's perspective. So you're right, there has definitely been a broad consensus that Xi Jinping's China has become more assertive generally since his assumption of power in 2012, which both Kushan and Tanir mentioned earlier. At least within the US, actually, there was a fairly optimistic reception of Xi Jinping when he first came into power in 2012. This has since largely deteriorated. So geopolitically, we see this as a response to salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea, more recently with the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, economically through BRI. And from Beijing's perspective, this could be driven by an opportunity to kind of fill a power vacuum that was left by the US through the Trump administration as it kind of undermined its own global power. But I think this narrative of China filling that US vacuum seems less and less viable now, as Beijing's own unpopular international reputation kind of undermines its own prospects of serving as an alternative hegemon. Additionally, others say that popular nationalism in Xi's China has been a main driver of this more assertive foreign policy. So there's good evidence that popular nationalism has grown since the 1990s, but it's not uniformly distributed, which is to say that it's more likely to drive policy towards Japan or Taiwan than it is towards India. Nationalism tends to constrain Beijing's policy options, but doesn't necessarily guide them, especially towards India. But in terms of this 2049 goals that you mentioned, so yes, these are the government's self-proclaimed centennial goals, becoming a so-called moderately prosperous society by 2021, and then the fully developed and modern socialist country by 2049. These are both designed to restore China's standard of global dominance, but I think are more driven by domestic and economic concerns, rather than driven, for example, by China's relations with its neighbors. But in terms of how India fits into these goals, so as others have written at Stimson and elsewhere, China sees India as a secondary threat, whereas India sees China as a primary threat. So specifically, China identifies this competition in the secondary strategic direction, which contrasts being with the US in the primary strategic direction. So where we do see India calculate into China's larger geostrategic concerns are mainly vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. Analysts and Chinese people more broadly are generally less concerned with India independently than they are as India as an element of a US-led containment strategy. So for example, after the most recent crisis, Chinese social media was more concerned with the fact that the government did not release the number of Chinese casualties, which they do not typically publish anyways, than India as a military threat on its own. But nonetheless, these border incidents do reveal underlying fissures in the relations. So both sides were surprised at the number of casualties, but I think there are still two major tensions or contradictions between China's behavior towards India and its larger geostrategic goals or policies. The first is the contrast between these localized incidents on the border and the larger diplomatic discourse, such as the title of this panel, the 70 years of China-India diplomatic relations. And then secondly is also Beijing's kind of larger goal of positioning itself as this regional connector, or others have written becoming an illiberal leader of a liberal world order, is in tension with its more short-term imperatives of fixing these territorial disputes, which we see is with its dozens of disputes with its neighbors. So towards India, India doesn't necessarily guide, but rather fits into those centennial goals. But concessions to India, at least in domestic discourse, would kind of delegitimize Chinese claims of relative strength and even regime legitimacy that it maintains towards its domestic populace, right? Because if it were to have these concessions to India, that undermines how it portrays itself as this global superpower. So Beijing may need to now rethink how this increasingly confrontational policy will align with these visions.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks. Very interesting, and sort of dovetails with what Antara was saying earlier. I'll ask my last question to the panel, but I just wanted to invite more questions in the Q&A box. There's already a couple for our panelists, but please, if you want to ask them anything else, just put it in the Q&A and just identify which panelist it's for, and I will get to those questions soon. But I wanted to come back to you, Antara, to some of what you were saying earlier. And in your piece for South Asian Voices, you argue that China's view of India has evolved from, a failed other to a new type of strong neighbor. And this view has particularly strengthened in the aftermath of the Doklam standoff, because many analysts have said that China was surprised at sort of Indian resolve and India coming to Bhutan's aid in the way that it did. And in your piece for The Hindu, which I recommend that everyone read, and you mentioned earlier as well, that you talk about the dilemma in China's foreign policy at the moment about India. That on the one hand, you have sort of the hardliners who are saying, teach India a lesson militarily, whereas the more moderate group is saying, try to resolve this peacefully for now, but there are other ways that you can, bring India down to size, whether that's developing relations with its neighbors or by weakening it internally. So in either case, it's clear that the Chinese perception of India is fairly negative, and in a sense, it has led to a greater appreciation of India as a threat. So in your view, how is this crisis going to impact India's China policy going forward? And is there any debate in Chinese strategic circles that by some of the aggressive actions that China has taken, that it's actually pushed India more towards a balancing coalition against it?
Okay, so how this is going to end and how this crisis is going to, impact China-India relations from the Chinese perspective. One point of view is that, China does not require to take initiative in improving the relations with India. And as I mentioned, that as long as there is no large-scale conflict in this direction, China is happy to have a very basic, very minimalistic kind of relations with India, with probably no room for discord and disagreements and even conflicts. So that is one line of thinking. And the other is, of course, about, you can also see the Chinese ambassador to India talking about this, about creating a positive atmosphere for a new comprehensive assessment of China-India relations, initiating new strategic dialogues, determining future directions, and formulating new interaction rules between the two sides and bringing the relationship back on track. However, the general understanding in China is that the negative impact of this incident is going to be much more severe than it was during the 2017 Doklam incident, and the reconciliation is really going to be difficult this time. And the key challenges probably which will come forward after this is the low level of mutual trust that is there between the two, and the increased strategic competition and greater involvement of what they call third-party factors in the bilateral relations, which somehow heightens the risk of strategic misjudgment or an armed conflict between the two countries. So that is one. Another thing is, of course, the security dilemma between the two countries is only going to deepen with mutual defense. The defense build up on either side and arms race to be intensified. And of course, in the economic and trade friction between China and India is also likely to be intensified, particularly in the context of the rise of a hostile spiral in public opinion in both countries. So, in other words, you could say that the situation is going to remain tense for a very long period of time from now on. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Antra. And I'll move to audience questions. We have a couple that are still streaming in. And I'll try to combine some questions that are, sort of on the same topic or on similar lines. So, Tanir, the first question to you, we have a couple of questions on the Quad. From Paul Murphy, he asks, has India maintained a non-aligned stance? Does this new era of India-China tension force a reassessment of India's non-aligned stance and present an opportunity for closer ties with the United States and other countries concerned with China, such as, the Quad? And Sharmishta Chatterjee asks, does India's focus on the Quad actually impact its relations with, other countries in the region? Should we be paying more attention to countries like, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives?
Thank you for the questions, Akriti. when it comes to the Quad, I think the very important point needs to be made. And I think our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, made that point very recently, that India will not be in any alliance in the foreseeable future. And I think that's a very important message that comes across from the government at a time when there has been an increased sort of calls for India to engage in a military coalition, engage with countries which have very deep-seated naval interests in the Indo-Pacific. So when it comes to the Quad, I don't see it as a naval alliance as such yet. There's a lot that needs to be done for the countries that are in question to reach that stage. To start off with, Australia will be invited most probably to the version of Malabar exercise this year, when this happens. So that this is a starting step when it comes to sort of engagement between the four countries. More importantly, if the Quad is designed to sort of counter China and just geared towards China, I think that's minimizing the Quad as sort of a containment strategy that a lot of policy analysts in Beijing call it. I think the Quad has a larger purpose in maintaining security and freedom and rule of law in the entire Indo-Pacific region. More importantly, the Quad also needs to engage with littoral states, both in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific Ocean, in capacity building, in building their own surveillance capacities, carrying out exercises with them. At the same time, while they are engaging with themselves as sort of greater naval powers, trying to sort of balance China in a larger strategic view. So in that sense, the Quad has a larger responsibility of building capacities in island nations, whether it be Seychelles, Mauritius, or countries such as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam. So there's a lot to be done across the board that the Quad can invest itself in. Minimizing it to just counter China or make it an anti-China coalition, sort of depriving it of the possibilities that are there. And more importantly, the point is also, while a military alliance or a naval exercise is great, I would like to see more economic cooperation from the countries that are involved in the Quad. I mean, Australia, Japan, United States, and India are probably the top 10 economic powers invested in the Indo-Pacific, while they are also very capable military powers. So the economic cooperation on the line of technology transfers between these countries, collaborating on 5th generation cellular phone networks, collaborating on cybersecurity, on new naval technologies. I mean, the opportunities are enormous for the Quad to do whatever it wants in the years ahead, without calling it a naval alliance as such, giving it a sort of a tag that needs to raise issues either with New Delhi or in Beijing, and at the same time achieve some of the end goals that it seeks to achieve by the time we see a more belligerent China, which it will in the next 15-20 years, as somebody mentioned, the 2049 goals that Chinese state has set out to achieve. Invading Taiwan is on the agenda of that, and when and where that happens, how will sort of the Quad coalition respond to such a move? That's going to be very important.
So thanks, Tanir. And to your point about the Quad being broader than sort of just a naval kind of mechanism, we've already seen some coordination on a post-COVID, how to sort of look at global supply resilience, how to counter disinformation. We've already seen that in the unofficial Quad Plus mechanism. So I think I take your point there. The next set of questions are on Russia, and Pushan, I'll ask you to answer these. So there's a question from Frank O'Donnell on why did the Indian MEA secretary or the Indian MEA agree to participate, I think Minister Jaishankar, Why did he agree to participate in the RIC trilateral meeting of foreign ministers at the height of the crisis? And there's another question from Sylvia Mishra on, Indian defense procurements going forward, as sort of India has weapons from both Russia and the US. Does that impact interoperability, and how do you see that going forward?
To Frank's question, it's difficult for me to answer why Jaishankar agreed to go for the RIC meet. But I would suspect it was some sort of mediation from the Russian side, which asked the Indian side to meet, help arrange it, or at least push the right buttons for there to be some sort of dialogue in the aftermath. But apart from that, but this is again my conjecture, and this is not the official MEA, any information officially from the MEA. Sylvia's question is interesting. I think there's been a lot said, and I think that there's been a stream of commentaries coming out that this is a great opportunity for the US and India to ramp up their defense relationship. India already operates a number of US systems. Here's an opportunity now that India is taking the China military threat more seriously to cooperate more, whether that be expanding what we already have or buying new defense systems, etc., etc. But when the conflict broke out, the first country that the Indian defense minister went running to was Russia. So, and that sort of threw water on all these hopes, so to speak, of the future of Indo-US interoperability. But I'd like to say that at the end of the day, and I think Samir, Akriti, you are both working on a paper, and I think it was featured in the Indian Express today, that India's the majority of India's defense equipment is Russian. I differ with the paper on some of the percentages and some of the platforms, but broadly speaking, it's safe to assume that 65 to 75% of Indian defense platforms on average are Russian. It will foreseeably be so for the next 20, 30 odd years. Now, how do you wean off that dependency tomorrow and be able to sustain your military logistically through their life upgrade programs, etc., without Russian help? If you decide to wake up one fine morning and go the American way because you feel that American weapon systems are the answer to counter China's military challenge, that is one. So I think India, at the end of the day, is going to take decisions based on its own national security needs, and also based on its budgets, available budgets, and of course the fact that we already operate a significant number of Russian systems already. And it's also a system where Indian armed forces can absorb very fast. And a colleague of mine, Angad, made a case in a paper recently that it's easy for us to buy more Sukhoi 30s. It's easy for us to buy more MiG-29s in a fast-track way because we have an infrastructure existent for these platforms. We have a pilot training system existent for these platforms. It is easier for us to push into service much faster versus buying brand new platforms. So that's one. So India is going to choose what it wants to buy based on what it feels it needs to counter certain Chinese military threats along its border or in the Indian Ocean region. But that is not to say that there is no scope for India-US defense cooperation and to improve upon its interoperability. I think India will choose to do more with the US, like Tony said, in the Indo-Pacific region. So, if we buy more P-8s, we buy, let's say, more anti-submarine warfare helicopters, etc., there's always scope to choose to cooperate, have interoperability in very specific systems, and not necessarily in a theater where the US is not going to play a major role apart from maybe sharing some intelligence information, etc., do I see US Air Force aircraft flying along our northern borders collecting intelligence on the Chinese or helping India in some way? I don't. So I think India has made that calculus that it's going to choose to cooperate with the US in a certain theater, and it is going to go for systems which it knows are reliable in terms of delivery, etc., training, logistics for another theater. And I think that is where Russia comes in. And of course, Russia, one of the biggest drivers of the India-Russia relations, the strategic relationship, is the defense relationship as well. and to keep it going, so butter that relationship, so to speak. I think it's important for India also to maintain that relationship with Russia. And plus, there are all sorts of issues with the US as well regarding CATSA. But as I said, India's dependency is so huge right now that, well, if tomorrow US chooses to enforce certain conditions in the CATSA as sanctions or whatever, I mean, India will have to make that choice for its national security that, hey, we will have to CATSA, we will still choose to go Russian because we need to.
So Riaz and Tuni, you both had quick thoughts on that question as well. 1 minute to each of you. Riaz first and then Tuni.
So yeah, I was also listening to Jaishankar's another, I think, a video, this webinar or whatever meeting with Raja Mohan, and I mean, his speech, he talked about de-escalation, and he talked about following China's economic model. I mean, India is facing some troubles in its domestic economy, especially the 5 Ls, this logistics and other stuff, bureaucratic stuff, that it's facing some troubles there. So I think, and in the whole, this posture, the meeting in this RIC meeting, Russia, India, China meeting, I think India wants to de-escalate, and the fact that Modi said that China hasn't violated Indian territory, and then there was this confusion by the External Affairs Ministry. But overall, I think the argument is that China and India both officially do not want to escalate, and they want to de-escalate. So I think this was the purpose to continue this mediation and diplomatic engagement. So that's my view on it.
Tanir, go ahead. Thanks, Riaz.
Just come across a couple of points made over here. I think there's a sort of reluctance in a lot of governments inside Asia about the United States and its ability to continue its sustained pressure and security presence in the Indo-Pacific or even in Asia. So I think for India, that plays into its calculation when it wants to buy equipment from the US or cooperate with the US. Russia seems much more easier, much more accessible, and it's much more direct relationship when it comes to acquiring equipment from Russia. And when it comes to the interoperability issues, I mean, we're acquiring French submarines, we have a Russian aircraft carrier, and we have an American maritime patrol aircraft. So interoperability sort of, I don't know, issues are built into the Indian Navy or its armed forces thinking nowadays. So using 3 different countries' defense equipment, I think the job is cut out for what the armed forces need to plan for in the future.
Pushan, I'll come back to you later. I'm sorry, I need to go ahead to the next set of questions. Antra and maybe Zoe, if you want to add as well. We have a few questions on, China's behavior in sort of the aftermath of COVID. And what do you make of, the sense of the opinion or the debate that China's fueling border tensions with India to kind of deter India from the economic opportunities that present itself in a post-COVID-19 world, that India is trying to replace China in global supply chains, or is trying to sort of take advantage of the fact that the countries that are trying to move production away from China are looking at India as a possible replacement?
Okay, so about India replacing China on the relocation of industries, I don't think China takes India so seriously on this front, and it believes that India has potential, but it is going to be a very difficult task for India to immediately get those industries moving from China. In fact, they're more confident about probably Vietnam or other Southeast Asian countries taking up the role of inviting industries from China. But as far as India is concerned, they are not very confident or not very threatened by this fact that India might. I mean, it might happen someday, but they're not right now. Immediately, industry will move from China to India. So yeah, that's the view that China say that.
Thanks, Antra. Zoe, do you want to add anything on that?
Sure. The only thing I can add is that I think China's COVID response more broadly hasn't been specific to India. So this kind of narrative that it's creating about being a successful responder vis-a-vis the United States and all of these other countries is not just specific to how it sees its relationship with India. I mean, the Hong Kong national security law can also be another example of a more assertive behavior in the wake of COVID-19. So its response could more largely be seen in a broader context rather than just specific to India.
Thanks, Zoe. So now we have a few questions on, the China, India, Pakistan dynamic. There's a question from Daniel Mackey, and it's for any panelists who want to take it. He asks, how seriously do the panelists take the prospect of India escalating militarily against Pakistan, in part as a means to signal strength and resolve to China? Are we seeing any talk of this outside of Pakistani circles, such as in China or in India? Tudir or Pushan? Pushan, go ahead.
I've read a few commentaries to that line that, since India was caught with spans down, so to speak, vis-a-vis the Chinese in Ladakh. Don't mind my terminology on this, but that's exactly how I view it. But, to signal strength again, the loss of prestige, it would probably initiate some sort of, look for an excuse to initiate some sort of action against Pakistan or some other state. But I tend to disagree with that notion. I think if nothing else, not to signal strength to China. I think it is more to signal to his own domestic audience that he's being strong on Pakistan. And it also goes into the whole larger narrative of, this government's policies vis-a-vis the Muslims in India, Pakistan being a Muslim state, the BJP government being strong on a Muslim state in Pakistan in that sense. So I think that has more traction domestically versus losing a few hundred meters of land in somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Ladakh. So I don't think if India were to initiate action against Pakistan because of terrorist incident emanating from Pakistan, it would be to signal strength towards China.
Yes, Tanir.
Reading a few commentaries here and there about China, starting or fomenting tension in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir by supporting Pakistani's action against with using proxies and separatism inside the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and now it has been divided into two union territories. And I think that plays into the Indian strategic mindset as well, where they are clearly delineating what they want to do with the union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and what they don't want to do with the union territory of Ladakh. And while India might be trying to separate those two, with one being towards China and one being towards Pakistan, I think the possibility of China and Pakistan collaborating using proxy elements inside Kashmir or even in other parts of India is something that plays on the mind of Indian strategists sitting in New Delhi. So while some people in New Delhi might discount this, this could be a remote possibility, if not certainly a big one in the days to come.
Riaz, I'll give you a chance to respond to that and attack on another question from Asma Khalid, which is, keeping in mind sort of the triangular ties between China, India, and Pakistan, how do you see the future of Pakistan-India relations evolve, and do you see any progress in the near future in that relationship?
Yeah, first this debate, Denmark's question on our outside perspective on India's possible showing of military strength in Pakistan. I think outside Pakistan, I think US. I think I was listening to some perspective of some US strategic analysts, and they were saying that India will be better served if it resolves this Kashmir issue and if it resolves this citizenship amendment issues. These human rights issues with Pakistan and domestically, then it will be in a better position to militarily counter China. So this was the outside perspective that I read about or listened to. And Pakistanis, I think the question that Pakistan, China, this collaboration for these proxies, or I think how Pakistanis think is that there was only once the chance to kind of make a joint defense union with China against India. It was in 1962. And I don't think Pakistan believes now in starting a second front. If there was anything, I think that something. There are some reports in Indian media, I think, about Pakistan's military deployment and stuff like that. And Pakistan, this ISPR rejected that. There's nothing of the sort. What Pakistan believes is now is that it wants to strengthen or stabilize its domestic security situation. For it's facing some great problems in economy. So it wants to stabilize not only domestic security situation but also borders with India, with Afghanistan. It has been doing some efforts on its western front of Afghanistan as well, and would like to see some peace with India. So this brings me to the question of Asma about the future of India-Pakistan relationship. Uh, After August 5th, 2019, I think, well, I think about this 370 part, I think Pakistan believes that it is India's internal constitutional act. And I don't think Pakistan recognized it when India enacted this law into its constitution in 1954, I guess. So I think Pakistan doesn't recognize it, and international community doesn't recognize or didn't recognize 370. I mean, UN didn't recognize, so Pakistan doesn't consider it as an issue. What Pakistan would like to see is that Pakistan and India can talk on resolving this Kashmir issue, human rights. I mean, there are basically two things that Pakistan wants. I mean, this wants India to address this human rights issue in Kashmir and the international law, that is self-determination of Kashmiris. So these are two things. About India's argument that unless terrorism stops from Pakistan, it will not start talks with Pakistan. I think Pakistan has arrested some of these UN blacklisted these groups and the leadership, and I think now Pakistan believes in making peace with India if India wants. I mean, now Pakistan has pushed the ball in India's court. That Pakistanis make an argument that India doesn't want to talk. India is belligerent and this and that. So Pakistan is awaiting Modi's call for peace talks, and I think Pakistan is ready for it. Yeah, only two things: human rights issue and international law in Kashmir. That's it.
Thanks, Riyadh. I think we have some time for the last sort of set of questions, and this is a question from Colonel Jack Gill, and I think for whoever wants to take it, but he asked, do the panelists see Chinese pressure in the Himalayas as a means to reinforce India's traditional continental focus on security? And will this hamper any effort to strengthen Indian maritime capabilities? Sunir, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure, I'll take that one. When it comes, I think China's actions in the continental domain is not only reinforcing its strategic edge over India, but it was also securing its own domestic approval when it comes to its territorial disputes all across the board. So India and China do not have any, maritime disputes as such between each other. So the continental domain is the only place where China can sort of push India and sort of reinforce its position when it comes to territorial disputes. So that angle is more important than, I believe if there was a maritime dispute between India and China at this point in time, China would play on that. And that has been the line of thinking that the Communist Party in China has taken over the past few months, whether it be in Taiwan, whether it be in the East China Sea, South China Sea, vis-a-vis its actions against the Southeast Asian states, on how it's trying to secure its territories in that region. And in the continental domain, India and China are engaged in that region, as Pushan said, over 100 meters, 200 meters tracts of land. It does reinforce Chinese ability to secure its territories. But at the same time, it sort of pushes India to reconsider some of the engagement that has been happening with its alliance partners, as one would call it, in the Quad. Do we need to put more focus, more capital expenditure towards our continental forces, towards our armed forces, and already dwindling naval budget needs to be further reduced. And that, I believe, does play into the mind of the Indian defense planner, the budgetary experts. But at the end of the day, it would be better for India to separate its continental strategic dynamics from its maritime strategic dynamics, especially in regards to China. I think Pushan might be able to better answer some of the continental dynamic questions and how the Indian naval budgetary planners plan for that.
Before we go to Pushan, I think, Tunir, the question was sort of, the argument that some people have made, such as, Samir Lalwani at Stimson Center, that Beijing essentially is deliberately trying to increase tensions on the border to kind of dissuade India from putting more focus in the maritime domain to sort of deter future actions. I think that was sort of the question that was being asked. So, Pushan, do you want to add anything?
Is India going to take on a new continental focus because of the Chinese threat? I mean, I think India has always viewed its primary security threat to be up north and continental, whether that be from Pakistan, conventional conflict with Pakistan, or nuclear conflict with Pakistan, or terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, or the disputed NAC. I mean, this incident recently turned violent, but as I said, these incidents have been happening many a time over the last 10 years, and those are only the ones that are publicly available, but troops do meet more often than that. So, I mean, India's focus has always been continental, and I think that is reflective in the last 5 years in where the budget for the Navy has slowly trickled down from the 19-20%. It was never 20%, it was 18-19%. I think it came to an all-time low of 13% last year, and I think this year might be around 14-15%. And but the thing is, I mean, at the end of the day, there are the Indian military is going through a number of reforms, so to speak. Unfortunately, some of these reforms require a bit of political will, where India's solution to its continental security concerns may not just be having an army of 1.2 million men standing at the border. India will have to cut its size of its army to be able to make money for capital expenditure, whether that be for the army, air force, or for the navy. And I think when that transition happens over the next 5-7 years, I believe there are already a couple of studies being conducted and a couple of suggestions already being implemented from the Sikatkar committee, where the manpower is being cut to free up more money for defense modernization. So I think the continental focus will remain, and I think India will continue to view it that way. Is that going to tie us down in terms of maritime? I mean, I don't think so. But yes, obviously the amount of money that the Navy gets to do its job will need to increase eventually when the time comes to start adding aircraft carriers, more ships and submarines, etc.
Thanks, Samir and Pushan. I want to end with a question for Antara and Zoe. So there's a question from Iftikhar Gilani, and he talks about, how the boundary dispute between the two countries has obviously been going on for decades now. And his question is like, why are the two countries unable to settle it? He talks about how the special representatives have now met 23 times since 2003. We know that there are, 5 to 6 border agreements that India and China have signed between 1993 and 2012. So what's the sense, in China and India on why the two are not able to settle the boundary? Antara first, and then Zoe.
Okay, so in the Chinese perspective, I have read a lot of Chinese scholars talking about this, why it is not being settled. Is that asking price of India is too high in terms of Chinese assessment, and they're of the opinion that India doesn't want to give anything in return, but wants to, take concessions from China. That is the Chinese perspective. But from the Indian perspective, it is felt that China doesn't want to settle the border dispute because it gives it a leverage over India and to destabilize the border from time to time. And India has been all its work behind and focusing on the border with China. So this is the difference between thinking on either side.
Yeah, I completely agree with Antara, and I think that is the $1 million question, right? Why hasn't this been solved? So not easily answered, but the only thing I guess to add is territorial disputes are core national interests, and so any sort of dispute that has to do with territory, giving up something that you have already said is yours is a lot harder than asking for more. So just the fundamental nature of that type of problem will be inherently difficult to solve.
And the fact that the Indian side has sort of pushed for delimitation and demarcation of the line of actual control, but there hasn't been a response from the Chinese side, at least since 2003. So clearly the two sides are seeing the issue very differently and don't even really agree on the interpretation of the line, if we can call it that. So that's definitely something that we will continue to watch in the months forward. We are out of time, but I want to thank all of you for joining us, and particularly to the panelists today. I think this was a really comprehensive and interesting discussion. And I'm sorry if I wasn't able to get to anyone's questions, but I'll make sure to bring them to the panelists if you just want to email me at avasudeva@stimson.org. The video discussion will be up on South Asian Voices as well as on the Stimson Center YouTube, so please look out for that. And for more analysis on India